there's a line in the film, and probably the book too, Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, in which William of Baskerville, the Franciscan monk, tells his novice Adso of Melk that without love, the world would be so peaceful, so calm, and so safe. And of course, we wouldn't give up love, even if that's true, but I feel the same way about doubt. Wouldn't the world be so calm, safe, and peaceful if we did not have doubt and we believed everything we were told? And we're really not far away from that now, right? A lot of us are quite close to being bipedal livestock. Anyway, we don't have hooves, but we might as well have hooves for all of the critical capacity that we sometimes show. And what I wanted to talk about is the isgp website. It's a guy named Joel van der Rijden, I think, and he's a Dutchman, and he's the one who posted, I think around 2008, the Dutroux information. So this guy, I guess, is just a private researcher. I don't think he's affiliated with anyone in particular. He's just posting his own stuff. And then there's a blurb at the top of his website that says that no one else links to him and that he doesn't get any. And then he has a lot of stuff on his website talking about how Google, especially since 2017, has been pushing his stuff down in the search results. And it's true, I've basically never heard anyone talk about this guy or his website. It's isgp-studies, I think is what it's currently called. It's gone through a few different iterations, and I think there's backups of it on Wikispooks. So if you want to look at it, I would definitely recommend that you go check out the guy's website, and definitely if you have some free time, go look up his large section on there called Beyond the Dutroux Affair, and I think it has 2 or 3 sequels to it where he's added more documents and different kinds of things. And what he's done is he's taken court records, news stories, things from prosecutors that they've turned over, evidence from these cases, and translated it from French and Dutch into English for you, for me. And so that's all really great. And I remember reading his website in a previous incarnation that's now, you know, it's shut down and moved and all that sort of thing. But he's still alive and he's kicking and he's doing good work. So go check that out, Beyond the Dutroux Affair. Don't eat before you read it. Steel yourself. I trust this guy. I don't agree with all of his analysis. I think a lot of it's sort of silly, but nonetheless, you know, this guy would generally be on our side of things if push came to shove, which one day it will. Now, the comment that I made at the beginning, and I'm making this video because there was a Belgian guy who posted on the YouTube channel and said that, you know, he's Belgian and he remembers this Dutroux stuff. So it spurred me to go look up the guy's website, look up van der Rijden's website and see what was going on with that. Okay, so the comment I made at the beginning was related to doubt and gullibility. How gullible, how naive, what are you, and what is your capacity to doubt what you're told? And I find it very strange that even at the ISGP website, even at Joel van der Rijden's website, this guy has an enormous capacity to doubt, to not be naive, to not be gullible, and to do analysis on so-called, I don't know what you call it, deep politics and conspiracy. But at the same time, there are certain areas that he refuses to get into, and to me seems to be sincere about his disbelief in these ideas. And so one of them is how can we say, the 6 Gorillion issue, the 6 Gorillion number. So he doesn't get into that, and he thinks all that is disinformation and stuff that's put out there to confuse people. And of course, we probably can't really get into that on YouTube, but I find that kind of strange because some of it is just factual questions about physics, which doesn't really carry any political content. Either diesel fumes can kill you or they can't, and either you can burn one body in the muffle of a crematory or you can't. Either you can burn 6 in there or you can burn 1 in there, and either it takes an hour for one or it takes 15 minutes for one. These are factual questions that don't have anything to do with politics, so they should be wide open for a critical audience. The other thing, what else was I going to say with that? The other thing that I think we can get into a little bit more, because it's not quite so well known and it's not so controversial as the 6 Gorillion, is Shiro Ishii and Unit 731 and Unit 100 of the Kwangtung Army in Manchuria in the 1930s and 40s. And I've read quite a bit about this and never made a YouTube video on it, but basically I think that the Japanese were the good guys in the Second Sino-Japanese War, and I think that the Chinese were being propped up by the Soviets on one side and the Americans on the other, and that the Japanese weren't really doing anything that was all that wrong or different from anyone else. And I want to say that it's in Hitler Born at Versailles by Leon Degrelle, where there's a fairly long section about in which Degrelle compares Japanese colonial enterprises to that of the British, Russians, and Americans, and finds that, you know, the Japanese colonial enterprise was in fact quite small in comparison. And then he also compares it to Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, and says, well, you know, it was small compared with these too. So basically, the Japanese had a minuscule colonial presence, which was just attacked viciously in the Anglo press, and the Soviets said, oh, this is all, you know, incredibly aggressive and hostile towards us. So basically, it's completely unfair, quote unquote, but it's unfair in the sense that it is lies, not in the sense that everyone is entitled to the same thing. So let's distinguish between that, right? To a great degree in geopolitics, might makes right. If you can take it, it's yours. That's it, you know, your control over territory is justified by your power. That does not, on the other hand, justify falsehoods and lies about a particular situation. So if that makes any sense. I'm not going to get into that too much more. So the Japanese had an incident, they call it, which is basically just a conflict in which they took over part of Manchuria, I think in 1932 or 33, and this had been going on for, you know, 20 years. They'd been expanding into Korea and China itself, and so they had taken over part of Manchuria and they started building it up with heavy industry and resource extraction. They brought in settlers that were Japanese, they brought in settlers that were Chinese, and they were looking at Manchuria as a long-term colonial project for their country to extend their limited space on their islands that they have. And so they weren't in the business of genociding people, they were in the business of building up their holdings on the mainland. They had no interest or incentive in killing everyone off and torturing people and all this sort of thing. Now, the 20th century saw air power, it saw aircraft carriers, it saw nuclear bombs, allegedly, and it also saw chemical and biological weapons. So these are the big military innovations. As a weak country, Japan, compared to the Soviet Union and the United States, Japan needed these force multipliers, and since they're a really smart race, Japanese are an elite race, they're really smart, so they can use technology to try to make up for their deficit in natural resources and in population numbers and in capital, right? They don't have a lot of factories, they don't have a lot of natural resources, but they're very smart people. So starting I think in the 1920s, but definitely by the 1930s, there was a Japanese bacteriologist named Shiro Ishii, and he started promoting the idea of bacteriological warfare, or germ warfare, biological warfare for the Japanese. And they established some of this stuff, I think maybe in the late 1930s, in Manchuria as part of their Continental Army, which was the Kwantung Army. Now, the Americans, the British, and the Soviets, I think, all had biological weapons in various stages of development, and as we know, the Germans and the British and the French definitely had chemical weapons in World War I. So the Japanese did something, we don't know really what, they did something in Manchuria during World War II, and then after the war, let me back up. The Japanese had signed a non-aggression pact with the USSR, I think right after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, maybe in 1940, maybe even in 39, 40, or 41, sometime in there, the Japanese and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact. I got so carried away talking about the big picture stuff that I didn't mention some of the specific facts about Unit 731 that I had wanted to talk about. In my opinion, the way that I think biological weapons would have to work, especially with the technology of the 1930s and 40s, is that they could only be used as defensive weapons. So you can't really, as Japan, for instance, in 1943, you can't really send a strategic bomber to Moscow and drop a bunch of plague fleas off and hope that it, really hurts the war effort of the Soviet Union. What you can do is you can infect sort of a borderline territory between yourself and the Soviet Union to try to make that area for resupply, transportation, and basically logistics to make it really difficult for them to re-up their forces to resupply. So it seems to me that that would have been the major function of biological weapons in that era, would be to try to disrupt enemy forces that are looking to invade you or already have invaded you. Whereas in the trial transcripts, which I've read about 2/3 of it myself, it's always phrased in terms of aggressive war, and that all these weapons were being developed in order to launch an offensive war on the Soviet Union. So, I mean, let me ask you guys, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to get a bunch of plague fleas, fly them over in a plane, drop them off into the Soviet Union, and then charge right in there? That doesn't make any sense. That's ridiculous. That's preposterous. And one of the other aspects of it that's preposterous to me is that there's all these stories about how these people were killed and mistreated and just tortured. It's really like Dr. Mengele and Nisley type stuff is what it is, but according to the transcripts, they took people and tied them up and infected them with plague fleas and tested various things on them and then killed them afterwards. Now that I do believe, because it's specifically mentioned in the transcripts that the people who were killed as part of these experiments were delivered to them by the gendarmerie, by the Japanese Kwantung police force. And so what that means is that these people were partisans, right? They were most likely communists. They were most likely sabotage agents, because there was enormous sabotage going on in Japanese or Japanese collaborator territory, where people would go in and blow things up, set fires, destroy railroad tracks, do all this sorts of sabotage and terrorism. And so yeah, these police are going to arrest these guys and then they're going to shoot them, right? That's what you do with partisans. You execute them. They don't go to trial. They're just killed. But since they had a bacteriological weapons program and they needed live people to test this stuff on, they're testing them on condemned prisoners, basically. People who otherwise would have been killed anyway. So this is not nice. This is not humanitarian. It's not liberal, but it's also not a mass murder torture project for its own sake. It's instrumentalist. These were people who had already been condemned to death, most likely, and they're just being killed in a particularly sick way for scientific purposes and warfighting purposes. And so That I believe. I do believe that that could have happened and probably did happen. But as to the rest of it, you know, to me it's just seems like a bunch of made-up nonsense. And then according to the Nuremberg trial transcripts, which I've read, some of that was going on in Germany too at the time, in which condemned prisoners were being experimented on at some of these concentration camps, and particular people who were outside of the camp system, scientists who could have used this data, sometimes did not want to mess with this data because they knew that it was very suspect in terms of international law and probably even some German law. And of course, you know, we have to say that all the other sides in the war were carrying on similarly inhumane and evil experiments, such as when the American Strategic Bomber Command, or whatever it was called at the time, would make a plan and then blow up some part of a German city and then try to check it out and do some tests to see how their bombing did. So what were they doing? They were killing civilians and destroying property, which is a war crime, and then getting scientific data out of it, okay, to use in the future, valuable scientific data. So there's no difference. Okay, I'm going to splice this in and then it'll go back to the main stuff. At the very end of World War II, the Soviets invaded Manchuria, took everything over. They expropriated all of the factories and capital that the Japanese had built up over the last 15 years, or ever how long they had been controlling that territory. They gave some of that stuff to China, or should I say to the communists under Mao. They took some of it home to the Soviet Union, and the Japanese colonial project was dead, and it's been dead ever since. Now, one of the things that they captured was the bacteriological arsenal that Shiro Ishii was running in Manchuria. I think maybe around Harbin, where those where that very interesting white Russian emigre activity, that Russian fascist and National Socialist activity was taking place. Maybe it wasn't in Harbin, but I think it was pretty close. So they captured the Japanese bacteriological arsenal, and they captured the staff too. Now, they put these guys on trial, and there was a Soviet show trial, basically, on these guys. I think the Americans actually got Ishii, but everybody else, I think, was captured by the Soviets. If you go to archive.org, you can find an English language Soviet publication from the year 1950 that is 500 pages of extracts from these show trials held against these Japanese bacteriologists. And as far as I am aware, all of the legends and horror stories and torture porn that has come out about the Japanese in relation to this subject, to Unit 731 and these bacteriological experiments and these biological weapons, it all comes from this trial. Now, there's no way in hell, all right, there's no way in hell that anyone is ever going to be able to verify any of this stuff, any of it. It is in the exact same situation as the trials that were held in, I want to say, Riga, dealing with some of the Einsatzgruppen and that activity in the Baltic, where they capture a bunch of people who were involved in some of this stuff. They put them on trial, they confess to these absolutely horrible things, case closed, it's over, everybody's shot or locked up in the gulag for the rest of their life. And then, I don't know what, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years later, people are repeating back a bunch of transcripts from a Soviet show trial as the gospel truth. And so now we've come full circle to where I started this. Joel van der Rijden on his website has enough insight and clarity of mind to see that so much of our political structure is just a bunch of elite pedophiles and blood-sucking, vampires associated with intelligence industries and the synagogue of Satan. and everything else that's wrong with the world. But then he very casually, on one of his articles, I think it says something like Black Dragon Society and Japanese fascism or neo-fascism. He's just using the stories about Unit 731, for instance, and the Nanking Massacre, which we're not going to get into that because that's a hot one like the 6th Guerrillion. We're going to completely leave that one alone, and we're going to go for this Unit 731 low-hanging fruit, is what I'm trying to do here. He employs the Unit 731 legend as a way to immediately move Japanese quote-unquote fascism into the territory of evil on the side of the bad guys. Because things would get really sticky, wouldn't they, if things like the Nanking Massacre or the 6th Guerrillion or Unit 731, if those in fact turned out to mostly be a mythological war propaganda construction dating from the Second World War to portray the victors, who were war criminals, major war criminals in and of themselves, as, this battle of good versus evil, and the defeated were the evil, and that sort of thing. So how is it, my friends, that even some of the most intelligent of us with the greatest clarity can overlook these obvious, enormous problems of saying, well, I'm going to trust these Soviet war crimes trial transcript selections, right? So now we're 5 or 6 degrees from anything tangible. How are we going to trust that and then at the same time say that we're overthrowing the power of these conspiracies to determine what we think? And I'm guilty of this too, and you probably are. And the saddest thing about it is we don't even know what we have taken for granted. We don't even know the extent of our naivete and our gullibility. We just don't know. So, well, what can we do about it? I guess just try to keep an open mind and keep an even temper. And when you see one of your brothers or sisters out there and they've been fooled by some of this stuff, just extend an open hand to them and say, brother, sister, I think that you should reconsider this, and I'm going to explain to you why. And it doesn't help that most of the time, people end up either you open up by flaming someone, or you extend your hand in friendship and goodwill and they react by flaming you back. So anyhow, I don't know. This is the only thing I can think of to do, because in this case, for instance, at the Institute for the Study of Global Politics, it's ISGP, I'm pretty sure, but this guy has a lot of very good information. It's very helpful, it's very insightful, but for whatever reason, he doesn't want to recognize the truth of the political orientation, and he wants to stay on the classically liberal. He wants to stay on the liberal side of the equation, and therefore he has to set up a firewall, or as somebody pointed out on another video, to put up a Mont and Bailey around this idea of freedom and liberty, I suppose. And then the intelligence agencies are the bad guys, and the fascists are the bad guys, and the communists are the bad guys, when in fact that's not how I see it. Okay, so go check out the website. Keep those things in mind as you read through it. Steel yourself and read beyond the Dutroux affair if you have the time and if you can stand it. And of course, not everything you read in that is going to be, reasonable or true, but I don't know. I feel like it's worth our time to read, and I feel like a lot of it is true. Okay. Thank you for your time.